Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Sero Boost, the Happiness Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We're champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Lu Ngo, coming to your ears from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's learn together. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Sero Boost. Now, in this week's episode, we are talking about the science of radical acceptance for happiness. I believe we have talked about this topic probably once or twice before, but today we're going to have a different angle with our guest, Sha-En Yeo. She is a TEDx speaker and a graduate of the prestigious Master of Applied Positive Psychology MAPP program at the University of Pennsylvania. She has been featured on national TV documentary Chasing Happiness, Straits Times, Business Times, and on radio 938 Live and Money 89.3 FM in Singapore. Recently, she was identified as one of LinkedIn Asia's top mental health advocates to follow. As the founder of Happiness Scientist, she has trained more than 20,000 people in Singapore and beyond. Her clients include Visa, GIC, Capital Land, and Love Bonito. Such a pleasure to meet you and talk to you today, Sha-En. How are you?
Thank you so much. I'm great. Awesome to meet you too, Lu.
Yeah. I think I'm going to begin this conversation slightly different than others because I don't get to talk to guests from Asia that often. Being a woman from Asia myself, migrating to Australia, I think it's just so great to connect with individuals like yourself and talking about topics like happiness and the science of happiness and radical acceptance. These topics are not that often talked about in Asia, especially in Southeast Asia, where I'm originally from. And I think, your perspective today would probably be slightly different as far as I remember the previous podcast that we have done about this topic. Now, I would love to know a bit more about the reason why you're here talking about this today, because, I think a lot of us probably aspire to learn more about psychology and positive psychology and things like that. But in Asia, it's not really encouraged. Not as much as it should be. And I was one of those people. So I'm doing a podcast talking to people like yourself who actually studied it. I didn't study it myself. So I would love to know a little bit more about your career journey, how you decided to do this and how it's been for you and why you would like to talk about this topic today.
Yeah, I started off my career as a teacher. And I was teaching middle school kids, the small ones, maybe 10 to 12 years old. And I guess as I was teaching, I realized that the kids were, very academic oriented, push, achievement. But not many of them had the skills to maybe relate to people, to have resilience, to be optimistic. And so sometimes when they fail, they'll think that their whole world is over. And I just thought as a teacher, is it my job just to teach subjects like English, math, and science? Or is it to teach them to be whole human beings who can weather challenges, who can, live life, And so I guess that's when I started looking into this area of positive psychology. Yeah.
Yeah, that's super interesting because I actually had a little bit of teaching background before I moved here as well. Yeah, so it's super relatable. I totally agree. Well, but I was also kind of one of those people that was kind of like teaching, but while I noticed that, I also pushed them because of the pressure that parents gave us as teachers, and I'm sure you can relate to that, especially in in Asia, in countries like ours. I believe it's even more. I would say prevalent to focus more on academic and gaining a really great job, great career, than focus on what you should know about your mental health and how you're going to carry yourself in life. How you're going to deal with challenges. From a mental health perspective. So this is great. We're gonna talk about it. Hopefully, we're gonna reach a lot of people in Asia specifically. I know that this is going to be helpful for a lot of my team members because that's where they're from. So I'm excited to talk to you about the topic. Before we do, we've got a section where we would love to go through so we get to know you a bit better. It's called Have You Met Sha-En? So I'm going to get to know you better through some of your favorite things. First of all, I would love to know what your favorite book is.
Oh, one of my favorite books is called Daring Greatly by Brené Brown. And I love it because she begins the book by talking about the man in the arena, quoted from, I think, Roosevelt, talking about when you're face down in the arena with all the mud around you, it takes a lot of courage to stand up and dare to be courageous all over again. So it's one of my favorite books because number one, I'm her number one fan. I read all her books. But it's also because she is like the queen of vulnerability, right? Her research focuses so much on how we always strive to be perfect, but in reality, human beings, we are all imperfect. And to show up day and day over and over again, we need to have courage. And that means that when we find ourselves in the arena, many of us want to continue face planting downwards and hope nobody sees us. But, we just have to stand up and fight to live another day. So I love that book.
Yeah, me too. And I've talked about Brené Brown so many times on this show. Our audience are probably like, Lu, we know you love Brené. Stop it. So yeah, I love it when one of the guests also loves Brené Brown like yourself. Thank you for sharing that. Definitely a great read. And I do love that analogy of the man in the arena as well, because I think, when you think about your life, if you think about the fact that you're dealing with so many things on a daily basis, and you think about that, and just sort of play the role in a way, quote unquote, play the role in your mind. I think it really helps to go through the day.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about a movie you've enjoyed recently?
Oh, a movie. Well, I just rewatched Top Gun Maverick.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I'm like a super Tom Cruise fan, but I thought that the movie was really touching. Like it brought back a lot of things from the first version of the movie. It talked about friendship. It talked a lot about, regrets and guilt. And I thought that it processed it in a way that was quite heartwarming. So yeah, I just enjoyed it so much.
Yeah, nice. I actually just watched it for the first time in January, I think. So not that long ago, even though the movie came out last year, I think. Was it last year?
Yeah, I watched it when it came out and then like I liked it, but then I thought, no, I need to rewatch this show because there's so many moments that you just want to pause. And now that it's on Netflix, you can pause and look at it and like, whoa, the dialogue or what happened there, or like the little nuances in their faces when they were talking about the difficult things or reflecting on people they've lost. We all go through loss and grief, and not everybody can capture those moments well.
Yes, totally. And I think I should watch the first part as well because I heard great things about it, but I just haven't got around to watching it. So I should.
It should be on your list.
Yeah, definitely. My list is very long, but I will. So you are our podcast guest, and I also know that you are a TEDx speaker, and I'm sure you've been on many podcasts yourself. But I don't know if you are a podcast listener.
I do. Yes, I love them. Yeah.
So which show would be your top favorite?
Well, besides Brené Brown, because obviously I'm biased, I also listen to The School of Greatness by Lewis Howes. And I love that because every single podcast has a really important message. And Lewis himself is he asks questions that go really deep. And so I listen to my podcast as I do my exercise, like whether it's a morning walk or my cycle. I just love listening and exercising at the same time.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great way to exercise. And sometimes instead of putting on music, I think it's good to put on a podcast. So thank you for recommending that show. I haven't heard that yet. Again, we'll go on my list. I will try listening to it. So I wonder if you have a role model or maybe multiple role models.
Yeah, one of my aunts, she is a role model for kindness. She's always looking out for our entire family. She's 84, going to be 84 this year. And she still has the zest and energy of a really young person. Yeah, and I just think that, there are so many people in this world and she's one of those that just loves unconditionally. I don't think I've met anyone quite like her.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that, especially, when guests talk about people that are from their family and, becoming their role models. I think that's just beautiful. It's I think it's not that common for for us to talk about people in our family, because sometimes it's kind of like, like, oh, I don't
Sometimes you
really.
have that kind of relationship, right?
I kind of don't want to mention that, but yeah, it's nice to see, people loving people in their families and having them as role models. I think it's really heartwarming. So thank you for sharing that. And finally, in this part, I would love to ask you about a course you've taken. Now, this could be from a long time ago or maybe something more recently. And even though it doesn't matter how long it's been, we'd love to know which one has been the most influential to you.
Yeah, I mean, definitely in terms of influence, it was the masters that I took 13, 14 years ago in UPenn. I went in there with the intention to learn as a teacher, because I was still teaching then, thinking of like all the strategies I could use from positive psychology that will help my students. But I guess there was a part of me that also wanted to understand myself better. So, I just threw myself head in. I was from Singapore and I uprooted my husband and my daughter, who was about 10 months at the time, and we just flew halfway across the world, doing this masters that nobody had heard about. And were, in the Asian context, my mom was like, can you make money after you do this? And I was like, well, I don't know, but it's something that touches my heart. It's amazing. It's all rooted in evidence. And eventually, yeah, it really changed my life. Cliche as it sounds, but I was plunged into an environment where there were no other Asians. We were all Americans or Europeans. And I was forced to look at myself in ways that I'd never done, talk about topics like spirituality, grief, all kinds of things, and really examine it from what I thought would be an Asian lens. But then I just discovered that it's just my lens. So it was really life-changing.
That's fascinating. I love that for you. And, I love to hear that because as I said at the beginning, again, as a fellow Asian woman myself, I think it's so important to know of people like yourself. And I'm glad to hear that even though it's kind of this big decision and your mom was kind of asking how you were going to make money off of it, you still went ahead with it anyway because it's important to you. And maybe this is a message we can teach kids, because a lot of them are scared. It's like, oh, if I learn this, will I make money? Well, does it really matter? Or are you interested in it? Because then the money will come. You can then make money if you're really interested in, making values. So yeah, a little bit, beside the topic, but I love this part. So thank you for sharing.
You're welcome.
Now let's talk about today's topic. So radical acceptance, I think, has been talked about, by a lot of people. I believe there are books about the topic. There are podcasts about the topic, so many of them as well. And, there are different lenses when it comes to this particular topic. But we are talking about happiness. So let's start with happiness. You've done this whole, as you mentioned, the whole degree that you did. It was in, positive psychology. And I think with that lens, we've had a few different answers of guests, but I like that you also said, it was the lens of Asian women or people or something like that. And you said, no, it's just my lens. So using the same principle through your own lens, what does happiness mean?
Yeah, the way I define happiness is daring to truly live. So there's three parts. The daring part, of course, is about courage, and the truly, I think, is about authenticity. Like, I find that so many people are going to work or just showing up, and every day we put on masks. Some people call them masks, some people call them shells, but we are putting a version of ourselves. And if you think about social media there, we're curating the kind of self that we want people to see. But it's courageous to really present who you really are, because you are exposed, I guess, in a way. And people see who you are. Sometimes we worry that people will judge us, worry people will treat us differently based on the color of our skin or whoever, or our accent or whatever it is, how we show up. So that truth, to me, is an important part of happiness. If we can be happy with who we are, then what's stopping us? If we're not worried about everything that people are saying about us. And then the last part is live. Then we can really live, because otherwise we're living by other people's narratives, other people's standards, other people's judgments. And I think if we can unpeel all of that, then we can have a wonderful life, because we feel so free, right?
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Absolutely. I think that freedom is hard to get, though, especially if you don't really understand who you are as a person. going right
True.
back to what you were saying earlier, that curiosity of understanding yourself better,
Mm-hmm.
and it kind of helps everything to fall into place. And I think, again, like not just the lens of Asian people, but I would say for a lot of people that I've talked to, we all go through this thing whereby we live by other people's expectations, just like what you were
Mm-hmm.
sharing earlier. And so
Yeah.
we don't actually know what we want, even what to study, where we want to live. There are so many different decisions. And, I remember reading this book about our 20s.
Mm.
And the author was talking about the fact that, a lot of the decisions you make in your 20s are just going to be the foundation for the rest of your life. And that
Mm-hmm.
sounds so scary. But at the same time, it kind of, some of it would be true. And I think most importantly, there's a part where it kind of says, it shapes who you are, but it doesn't define who you are. And so I think that's also
Mm.
important to hear, because I
Yep.
know for a lot of people, they start over later in life when they actually know who they are. So happiness is such a journey, right? Where
Yep.
you think, okay, if I mess up now, I won't ever be happy. But really, not really. I think it's just this constant journey of figuring out who you are.
Mm-hmm.
The better you know
Yeah.
yourself, the happier you'll be.
Yeah, true. I mean, people often ask me, like, how do I get happiness, as if it's like a commodity or that it's a destination, but you word it correctly. To me, it's a journey, and it's a constant state of evolving who we are, right? And so, yes, maybe we've got it sorted in our 20s or whatever we call that, and then reach our 30s, and it's a new milestone, because maybe by then you have kids, and then you have to change, you have to kind of, get used to the new you. Right. And then by the
Absolutely.
40s, your kids are a bit grown up, and then your career, you're like, is this really what I want to do? And I think if we stop putting all these standard milestones on ourselves, then that freedom comes, that you can reinvent, you can choose whoever you want to be, whenever you want to be. Right.
Absolutely. And again, it goes back to your definition of happiness. So thank you for sharing that. And what about misconceptions about happiness? Because, I'm sure you've noticed quite a few.
Mm. Yeah, I think there's always this if then. If I do this, then I'll be happy. If I get this bag, then I'll be happy. If I get this job, then I'll be happy. I mean, to a certain extent, I can understand, because it's almost like that misconception that we need to have this box ticked, A, B, C, D, E, then I'll be happy, because that's the narrative that I think was painted to us. Right. But if we continue to believe that, then our happiness is conditional on something. And likely it is something to acquire. Right. So then what happens if we take those things away? Can we actually be happy? So to me, that misconception is that happiness begins with ourselves, learning to love ourselves, learning to know ourselves, learning to accept who we are. Right. And then once we have that foundation, then okay, if you want to go out there and pursue whatever it is, great, because then you have that foundation that comes from inside, as opposed to something external making you happy, because that can be taken away.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so true, because I remember when I was going through a tough time, I was kind of thinking about when I was a kid, and I was like, things were so simple and I was
Yeah.
very happy. And why was
Mm-hmm.
that? And, I was kind of like trying to understand and unpack why I was so happy. And I realized that, what, it's just because I had lower expectations, and I was just focusing on the day that I was going through, instead of thinking 5, 10 years ahead, or, whatever else that I don't have yet.
Mm-hmm.
Social media is a very big factor of that. And, even talking to others who are kind of playing the game of status, whatever that might be, chasing certain things, you get influenced by other people's expectations. Whereas as a kid, you'll have this sort of simplistic view of, okay, today I have my homework, and this time I'm going to go to bed, and I'm going to do this, and sometimes it can be stressful with all the exams and whatnot. And I do remember that, and I remember, I could not wait to be an adult. I was like, I just wanted to be an adult. And a
We
lot of
all
people,
went through that stage.
yeah, a lot of people can relate to this. And I'm like, wait, hang on a second. So as a kid, I just wanted to be an adult. And now as an adult, I just wanted to go back to being a kid. So the moral of the story is just to be content with what we have right now, and understand what makes us happy.
Mm-hmm.
Because each of us would have a different thing that makes us happy. Like, to me, simplifying how I approach my days,
Mm-hmm.
having goals, and having people around me that make me, feel engaged and appreciated, and that I can appreciate. So kind of breaking that down, and there's so much more to it, but I'm giving the example of understanding what worked for me to rebuild that sort of approach to life. Really helps, because I think a lot of the times we're just overcomplicating life.
Yeah, I mean, happiness to me can be very simple. Sipping a cup of coffee, enjoying the moment, right? Walking down the beach with someone that you care about, sitting there, enjoying the sunset. I mean, all these little moments, I think we sometimes take them for granted, and we try to focus on the big moments, like the fireworks moments. But the truth is, those fireworks moments, they are not there every day. But the little moments are there every day. But
Totally.
are we stopping to look at them? Are we stopping to savor them? Are we stopping to enjoy them and cherish them? I think sometimes we live in such a hustle, fast forward world that we've forgotten how to press pause and just be there,
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
And, it's kind of related to today's topic in a sense that we probably don't notice the little things we already have. And so when something happens, we kind of have this certain expectations that things are supposed to go a certain way. And even the little things, right? Sometimes when you're having a tough week, the little things don't happen either. And so you're kind of like, oh, why am I feeling off? And you just feel uneasy, and it's just really hard to go about your days. That's at least what I've noticed with myself. And then I realized that, I didn't appreciate the little things. Now they're not here anymore. And now I kind of I feel like I want them and I need them. At the same time, when we're going through a tough time, it's just really common for us to have this pattern of dwelling on what we are going through. And I think radical acceptance really helped. And an example I can give is probably, this is really, really funny story. Probably not a lot of people will relate to this story, but for me personally, when the pandemic hit, I had just graduated from my master's program. And I remembered, as a back then international student in Melbourne, I was looking for a job and I had pretty much no luck. And I was kind of running out of money, savings was running low, and I was kind of like, okay, what am I going to do? And then the pandemic hit. And I was like, okay, we are going to be in lockdown, apparently. I'm okay with that. Because Melbourne has the most number of lockdowns in Australia, I think. So at the beginning, I was kind of like, okay, whatever. It's okay. It happens. And I did not feel like I was going crazy at all, because I was, for some reason, I just had that attitude of, okay, it is what it is. It already happened, but everything will be okay. I just told myself that. And about a week later, I got a job offer from an internship that I did not long ago. And the pandemic kind of urged them to hire me because, previously they were kind of like, oh, we're not going to hire international students. But then because of the pandemic, they had no one to hire.
Right.
And I was a good candidate for them. So they were kind of like, okay, let's go ahead with her. And I was like, okay, that's good. And then fast forward, lots of things happened. And then we had more lockdowns. And a lot of people in Melbourne were complaining, and, they were really upset. And I definitely empathize with them. They're probably not used to it. But to me, I had to start out my career, and, lots of things happened, and I was just kind of okay with it. I felt okay with being locked down. I was definitely sad that I couldn't see friends or family. I could only talk to them on the phone. But I tried to focus on the fact that, I can still talk to them and build this connection with them, because thanks to the wonder of the internet. And I felt great about it. So obviously it was not an amazing period by any means, and it was tough for a lot of people. But what I realize now upon reflection is the fact that I had that radical acceptance. I don't know why or how it happened, because normally as I think I'm I would say a pretty anxious person that's kind of finds it hard sometimes to deal with things that are not going my way. And so that was the first time that I found that I was okay with it. And I don't know, for whatever reason, if you ask me why, I wouldn't be able to answer you straight away. I probably have to do some self-analysis. But that really helped. So it helped me through that time. And and anytime I think of that, I think about what is happening now, and it helps to gain that perspective. And all of that, to me, is thanks to radical acceptance. And that's what I realized personally. Now, I'm not sure about the audience. So maybe some people might start to wonder, okay, but what do you mean by radical acceptance? So how would you define radical acceptance for our audience?
Yeah, I think it's accepting that what happens to you sometimes is out of our control. And so often we try to fight it. Many of us have inbuilt fighters, right? Because we think that, oh, if we only just do this, things are going to move into my direction. Well, sometimes that does help. But I think we also, like your story tells me that everybody has limited energy, time, and effort. And you can choose to focus your attention on areas that actually can produce something, right? And in the time of pandemic, everybody's so worn out, everybody's disconnected, that choosing to focus on the things that are working is an incredibly important skill. And that can only come by accepting that whatever it is now, that situation is not within your control, right? So I guess it's also about embracing and honoring whatever it is you're going through. So you're going through a hard time. Many people just want to numb it away. They want to Netflix it away. They want to drink it away, right? But can't we just pause and recognize that, hey, humans going through difficult things, you are not the only one. We all go through it. And perhaps instead of running from it, we can sit with it and recognize that this is part of it, because the suffering is painful, yes, no doubt. But are there things that we are learning about ourselves, that we are learning about the people around us, the situation? Right. And I think if we go into that mindset, then the suffering doesn't have to be so great, if you know what I mean, right? It's there, it's painful, but the more you think, this shouldn't be happening to me, why me? This is so unfair, then you actually amplify your suffering. But if you accept it, you're like, okay, so this is happening. Yeah, well, it's awful, but I'm going to do what I can. I'm going to face it, but I'm also going to say, all right, there's other things that's around me that I could focus my attention on.
Totally. I think it's similar to that saying, change what you can and accept what you cannot change.
Yeah, the serenity prayer, right?
And also, I think somebody also talked about this. I can't remember who started this, but they were saying that, sort of let go of that grip, because I think it's kind of a good analogy when you think about it. Sometimes we just kind of have this grip we hold on to a certain situation, or it's just kind of like when you are facing a difficult time, sometimes you subconsciously, unconsciously just squeeze your hand and turn into a fist like this, and it's just kind of hard to let go. Part of that is because we want to be in control. And I think it's really hard. And exactly like the definition you just shared, we just focus on what we can do, pretty much.
Yeah, and I mean, sometimes for people who are really struggling, sometimes what they can do is just to get out of bed that day. And I think sometimes we're so hard on ourselves. Like, I didn't achieve this, I didn't do that, I didn't do anything all day. Well, that's okay. I think part of radical acceptance is also giving yourself some compassion and giving yourself permission to have down days, because we're not robots. We can't just put a emoji smile and just be okay, right? I mean, if we have a bad day, we have a bad day. We all have bad days. And we can be a bit more compassionate to ourselves when we do go through difficult things.
Totally. I think another thing I would love to pick your brains on is the fact that sometimes I feel like when we talk about radical acceptance, we think about particular situations or circumstances that are kind of like they are big events. But I also find that when it comes to small things, it helps too. So, big picture wise, this is probably something we can apply in our daily lives, and it really helps with our overall happiness, because I find that for myself, particularly, it's hard to be okay with things not going a certain way. Like, I have an expectation. I'm a planner. I need things to be like a certain way. It needs to be like at this time, I want to do this and that. And, sometimes it's just really hard to enjoy the day when that happens, and when I don't have radical acceptance. So I gave you an example earlier about something that's traumatic to most of us. But on the other hand, we have the little things in the daily lives too. And that I also find that while I could handle the situation of 2020, I sometimes cannot handle the little things. And then the little things add up. And I think it's actually quite important to balance both and apply this, more frequently than we think. Because if we are talking about this topic from that lens of, okay, difficult times, let's have radical acceptance, practice it, I think it's not going to be as effective as think about it as something we can apply on a daily basis for our overall happiness?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it's got to do with regulating, right? Self-regulating, right? You see, when you notice that something's causing anxiety, the tendency is that we want to control it and bring it back into the normal state, whatever normal is to you. But maybe what's more helpful if we practice the acceptance is saying that, oh, wow, I'm feeling this anxiety in my chest, in my stomach. Our minds and bodies are not separate. And very often we just want to go down the intellectual path because it's easy. But we need to also tune into our body, like, where am I feeling this, right? And maybe what is the emotion that's tied to this? Where is it coming from? It's a curious and gentle inquiry into what's happening internally, right? And then we notice, oh, wow, yeah, my heart rate was going this thing. I think maybe something someone said was triggering. And we're not judging, we're just noticing. And being able to hold this space of observation can be very powerful because you don't have to decide anything in that moment. You're just noticing, right? So we notice all these things, and then we want to do something to just regulate the body first, whether it's those deep breaths that you take through the diaphragm, right? Those deep, long breaths, whether it's going for a walk, whether it's journaling, we need to find ways to get that system back into normal regulation. So I think if we understand how the body works, the nervous system works, we can regulate back. And that's what I mean by, like what you're saying, right? The little things. Can we come back? Can we come back? It's a practice, it doesn't just happen overnight.
Yeah, we'll have another practice section in a bit. So hopefully we can pick up on some other practices we can try. But I think those are some good examples for sure. With self-regulation, super important for radical acceptance. I mean, it can sound like, in my head, initially when I heard of the term, I was kind of like, oh, radical acceptance. Is it like, sitting in a lotus position and breathing and things like that? No, actually, now that I know more about it, I understand that it's not, sitting in a lotus position and meditating and, breathing and letting things go. It can be done at any point. It's important to have that knowledge. And the other thing I would love to hear from you, with the perspective of what we just discussed, is sometimes when we talk about radical acceptance, a lot of people are kind of saying, okay, do you mean that we just accept everything and we are just not going to do anything about what happens to us? Which is kind of sound like just resign to the circumstance. Whatever happens, you let it happen. But I don't think that is entirely true, and that might mislead people when they think about radical acceptance. So, what is the nuance here? Because there's probably a fine line between radical acceptance and just letting go and not caring at all.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say letting go and all that is what we call like the blah or whatever, right? You're just a sitting duck and you have turned on the victim mentality. But that's the difference. A victim just waits for things to happen and is not passive, and maybe even to the extent of blaming the whole world for the plight that you're in, right? So if you're not doing anything, it doesn't mean that you're accepting. You're resisting to a certain extent, and that requires effort. I mean, acceptance also requires effort, but it requires you to be able to discern, what am I accepting in this moment? It's not blanket. I think when they say things like that, it's like this huge blanket coming on and it must be everything. But as the example that you've quoted, as the example I've given earlier, we can accept certain things because we know that in this moment, it's maybe not the battle that we want to fight. But there are other things that we can continue to be active and not the victim, but saying that, hey, there's something that we can work on. So, I mean, give you an example. Last couple of years, my dad's not been very well. And initially, it was really hard to, quote, accept because he went from a super active 3 times a week playing tennis to somebody who just couldn't cut an apple. And sometimes when the change happens so quickly, it's hard to accept in the moment because your brain needs time to adjust to this person you're used to, right? But over time, acceptance means, oh, wow, he is really having this struggle. And instead of fighting it, you're like, okay, what's present now in this moment? What can we help him with now that could make him feel a little better in this moment? And it's different from fighting it by saying, oh no, this can't be happening. Like, he'll be fine tomorrow. Let's just take a pill and he'll be okay. There's a different energy surrounding fighting, accepting, giving up, being a victim, and for sure, for the first few months, I there was a bit of blame, right? I'm not a filial daughter. I could have done more to notice this. But again, that's also not helpful, because in that moment, you can't help him when you're so low on yourself and so hard on yourself. And I guess radical acceptance is saying, well, something is going on with dad. We don't really know what it is, but let's keep trying to have questions to the doctors and find out what's going on. So you are still working on it, but you're not blaming, you're not fighting, you're not running away, you're not dismissing. And so it's an active process, radical acceptance, as opposed to just sitting there waiting for stuff to happen to you.
Yeah, that's a really good example. And thank you for sharing that. I'm sure it must have been really hard to talk about. But yeah, I think that's a really good example for a lot of people, because they might be struggling with similar things. Because sometimes it's not something that we had any warning of.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to family.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm sure probably a lot of people went through this during COVID, again, reference of a really tough time. But I also, my family went through something really tough last year. We lost a family member, and it was, out of nowhere. And it was kind of a shock. And I kind of think that a lot of us are still in denial. And, loss is something we all deal with. Yet we don't talk about it because it hurts a lot. So, we still deal with it. And I think for, the people that are closest to this family member, it was extremely hard to even say, hey, I accept that it happens, because on some days when we have conversations and I catch up with, them from time to time, they would say, I still don't believe it happened. It's still not, like, it's fresh wood. It's still not like it happened at all. It's just like, oh yeah, that person's still happy, healthy, and alive somewhere. And so, it depends on what kind of a situation we're talking about. I think it depends on the severity of the matter, and, it depends on whether you can do anything about it. Because I think, talking about things like loss, it would be probably insensitive to say, just accept it, right?
Yeah,
it's
definitely.
definitely harder to say that. And I think radical acceptance can probably still be applied to a certain extent. You accept that they are no longer here. You cannot, see them, hug them, and, give them love, or, talk to them. But it doesn't make it any less worse, less bad than it used to be. So I think there's a lot of nuances when it comes to the topic. It's actually quite tough, because we're having a really uplifting and positive conversation right now. But I'm conscious that for a lot of people, when they go through things that are extremely tough, like the example I just gave you, it's probably not that easy to just say it, like, drop it as an advice, or, something that we can practice.
Yeah. I mean, when it comes to grieving and loss, I think the way I look at radical acceptance is it's okay to grieve. I think we get a lot of messages that we must get over something, move on. But if you speak to the experts and observing, I used to work in a department where we dealt with all the emergency cases in schools. And there was so much of that going on. And one thing that we learned was that it's never about having a timeline for grief. It's accepting that grief comes and goes, and it looks different for everyone. So radical acceptance in this kind of example is that honoring that the timeline may be different for someone else, that some people may look all put together. It doesn't mean they aren't crumbling inside. Sometimes family members get irritated with each other. It's like, why aren't you crying? But people show, right? I mean, like, people show grief in different ways. Some just power on and deal with it 3 years later. Some break down in the moment and can't get themselves together. I mean, there's so many ways. So part of that is also recognizing that it's okay to experience this and allow the emotions to flow. Very often we try to hold back because we think, oh, we don't want someone else to be affected. Maybe that's a very Asian thing, right? We're very collectivist in that way, and we don't want to make other people upset. But that has a negative impact on us, the person experiencing it, because our emotions have no outlet. And I think with radical acceptance, we honor every emotion as valuable. That's teaching us something. Loss tells us we value that person a lot.
Yeah,
right?
I couldn't agree more.
And so if we stop dismissing all these quote unquote bad emotions, maybe we'll have a much more broader experience of what it means to be human, right? And
Totally.
yeah.
Yeah, I think it's again, not something Asian people talk about quite often. I know that from my own family, because I think it was actually like when what happened, what I just told you happened. We just like I obviously broke down. I was on the phone with my mom. I was kind of like I wasn't sure how to react, and I didn't know how to talk to her about it. You know, I didn't know how to ask how she was feeling. In English, it's so easy to talk about it for me and also with my friends, you know, my international friends here. It's so easy to talk about it. And yet when I was talking to my mom in Vietnamese, I was finding it really hard to ask her how she was feeling and how the family was feeling. I suddenly did not have the word for it. So I think it's actually and this has a cultural lens to it. It probably requires a lot of in-depth research to know how each culture reacts, right? But I just want to point out that, you know, in the Western culture, where a lot of the research has been done, I know that, you know, people are kind of saying, you know, like talk about it, accept it, and you know, go in depth. And I think, interestingly enough, for me, that's easy to do in English, not in my native language, with my, you know, my family and friends, and sometimes it takes practice too, you know. And I think this probably will help bilingual people who are kind of, you know, to having different parts of themselves, like myself. And I know that for a fact that a lot of people who are listening to the podcast, they might be of that group. Because, you know, now we have a lot of people migrating and living across countries and moving to different parts of the world. And I feel like that is where it gets really hard to deal with situations like this, where you kind of have to embrace radical acceptance, but knowing how to deal with it from that cultural lens.
Yeah. I mean, I think another thing is, you know, we are where we are. I think sometimes there's this need to rush, push, hustle, you know, and it's okay to be where we are, you know. And if we're finding it hard to express it in a certain language, that's okay. I know sometimes it's hard because we want to rush in to comfort somebody, you know, and that's why, you know, we think that we can fix the situation. But maybe just being on the phone and even in silence can be very comforting to at least know you're not alone, right? So, I mean, if some of the listeners feel that I don't know what to say, maybe there's no need to say or do anything at that point, except maybe just be present, because your presence alone can be powerful.
Yep. Thank you for sharing that. And I think we've covered quite a bit of the theoretical aspects of radical acceptance. And you mentioned a few practices that people can try, you know, when it comes to self-regulation. But let's get into practices and habits specifically about radical acceptance. So this is probably something that you do yourself, and I would love to know what you do, maybe on a daily basis for little things, from little things to big things, something we can apply. What would be a practice or a habit that you personally use to, you know, have that sense of radical acceptance built into your daily interaction, so that, you know, you work on how you carry yourself, how you interact with the world, and essentially just help you with your happiness?
Yeah, I think in recent times I've become really conscious and become aware of what I'm experiencing, not just my thoughts, but as mentioned earlier, like my emotions and my body. And when I notice that, I can either journal it down, or sometimes I just talk out loud. It looks a little bit silly. But, you know, science has found that if you label your emotions, even just verbalizing it, that emotion now has expression. And I think that's something that many of us do not do. We swallow it all back inside. And that's very harmful, because the moment we swallow it back, it's like you stop being there. You don't belong here. And emotions and all these kind of thoughts have a funny way that if it's all stored inside, then actually you're not accepting it. You're denying it. Like you said, we are in denial of what we are experiencing. So to me, the most healthy practice is to recognize that it's there. If I can express it somehow, label it somehow. And then if it's something that's really difficult, I could say, okay, I'm just going to hold it there for now. And then find a time when I'm feeling better in my emotions to get back to it. Because, we don't have to address it straight away. Sometimes we're not in the best state. So to me, that has helped greatly.
Thank you for sharing that. I think it's a good practice that is probably applicable to a lot of different situations, not just radical acceptance and, how we're going to build up that ability to have radical acceptance in our lives. What I do think about a lot when, the thoughts that were crossing my mind when you were talking about it, which is funny, is the fact that my partner has this really funny way of expressing frustration where he, like when there's something that's happening, whether it is big or small and it's annoying, he just makes a sound. It's a really funny sound. I'm not going to make fun of him, so I'm not going to try to imitate it. But when you were talking about it, I realized that, it actually helps when he does that. And I've actually picked it up from him now. And, it kind of helps to release that frustration or whatever emotions we're feeling at the time. And I actually find it like I feel better after I do it, even though I didn't technically verbalize the emotion. I do feel better. It's just you kind of let it out. Another example is, sometimes when my friends and I were kind of having a tough time with something, we're just like, should we go have a yelling break? Just like yell at nothingness. It helps.
It certainly does. I mean, there's also shaking or exercising. I mean, a lot of people turn to exercise to release emotions.
Yep.
But I mean, if you don't have like 30 minutes in the middle of a work day when you've just had a really difficult conversation with your boss, for example, you can still use movement to help you, right? 10 jumping jacks, 10 push-ups, like air boxing, whatever helps, because sometimes it's just about that release, somatic release from the body. And if you want to, emotional release, like yelling is great, as long as it doesn't hurt anyone. Some people punch a pillow, have a soft toy, all that stress ball. I mean, all these things are created to allow for release. It's just that, some people don't do it because they feel, what if someone's watching me, and that prevents them from getting it out. But we all know what happens when these things get pent up, right? It gets projected somewhere else.
Yeah.
Right? And then that ends up ruining relationships, which is then becoming this vicious cycle.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, and certainly these are small things we can practice on a daily basis, or at least whenever we feel the need to kind of release that feeling. And I think naming emotions is actually important, but quite tough, because a lot of us, we don't even know what that feeling is. I deal with this on a weekly basis at the very least. And some days I would get asked, how are you feeling? I'm like, I don't know. Meh. Like, that's all I can say. And it's kind of hard to name that meh, because there are so many ways of naming the meh, as well as there are so many ways of naming I feel great. But how great? It's kind of different. There are different kinds of great. There are different kinds of meh. And I think maybe building that vocabulary is important. I think Brene Brown has the whole book on that. So,
yes, Atlas of Emotions, right?
The Atlas of the Heart. Atlas of the Heart, yeah.
Oh, yes, Atlas of the Heart, which delves into all the different, you're right.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great book to kind of refer to when we want to label it and understand and accept how we're feeling. I think it's good because, again, I think a lot of us just don't have the vocabulary for it. I learned a lot from that book, and there are other resources that I know would help us as well. They're free. So, that's a good place to start. So now that we are towards the end of the podcast, we've got open mic where you can talk about anything you would like to share with us today. I know you've shared quite a bit about radical acceptance and happiness. I'm not sure what else you would like to share with the audience, so take it away.
Yeah, so I have a YouTube channel which I launched last year called Sha-En Speaks. And I guess by profession, I'm a speaker, trainer, coach. And every time I go into a new audience, I often, after the whole thing, I get a lot of questions that people ask me. And I realize that I answer the questions, but it's only for that audience. And yet it's not for other people. But I realize the questions are very common, number one. Number two, actually it's really valuable information. So I started the channel because it's going to be like a question answer kind of format. I take questions from the people that I meet, the people who post it on my socials, and then I record a video to answer it in as much detail as I can, right? And I think it helps people to make sense of certain things that they are processing. So yeah, I mean, I just started it. I'm kind of in a busy period right now, but I'm going to hop back into it somewhere around May or June. So look out for it on YouTube.
That sounds great. Thank you so much for sharing. It sounds like a wonderful project, and I will definitely have to check that out. Thank you for sharing. And if our audience would like to get in touch with you or find out more about your work, which website or pages should they go to?
Yeah, on LinkedIn, you can look for me, Sha-En Yeo, MAPP, CSP. And then on IG, I go by Happiness Scientist or Sha-En Yeo, which is my private account. And then Facebook is Happiness Scientist as well.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing and for coming on today.
Thank you for having me.
You have been listening to Sero Boost, the Happiness Science Insights podcast produced by the Happiness Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, share, and subscribe to our channel so that other people can find it and we can continue to provide quality content. More of our work can be found on our website, ha.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Lu Ngo. Thanks for tuning in.